Okay, so in chapter 14, we're going to first talk about inflation and its causes, and then the relationship between inflation and unemployment, and then finally the role that monetary policy can play in trying to control inflation and bring the economy back to full employment and potential GDP. So, governments, we talked about, use fiscal policy, spending and taxation to help stabilize the economy, especially with automatic stabilizers, things like unemployment benefits and progressive taxation. But monetary policy sometimes plays an even bigger role in stabilizing the economy. And so what we want to do with that is try to first understand where inflation comes from, and then what level of inflation central banks would like and how do they achieve it. And we'll see that sometimes central banks are more effective in responding to certain types of shocks than they are other types of shocks, and we'll see those later on in the chapter. So, inflation is a general rise in the price level, as we'll see, and it can be costly because it can mix up signals in the economy, and it can make it much harder to buy and sell things when inflation gets very high. On the other hand, we also don't want deflation, where prices are actually shrinking. We'll talk about why that is. And so the central bank is trying to manage the money supply and interest rates in order to control how much inflation there is in the economy. And one of the things we'll see is that in the middle of the 20th century, we thought that there was a much tighter relationship between inflation and unemployment, so that central banks could actually kind of choose where they wanted to be in terms of do they want higher unemployment and lower inflation or vice versa. And we'll see that expectations are actually very important and basically mean that the central bank does not have as much choice as they originally thought. So inflation is a general increase in the price level. So remember, the price level is a weighted average of all the prices. So usually we're talking about something like the Consumer Price Index, which is a weighted average of all the prices faced by consumers, or something like the GDP deflator. Price levels are all related and they tend to move up and down together, although they might not be exactly the same. We'll see that in the original Phillips curve, which is the relationship between inflation and unemployment, the average inflation was very close to zero. And so most years people expected kind of zero inflation, which made sense in a economy that had the gold standard, in which the value of money was based on the quantity of gold. We'll see that we don't generally have zero inflation right now, and we'll talk about why that is. Deflation is an actual decrease in the general price level. So the price level is actually going down. They have an example in the book. They say, well, inflation is like a car driving forward. Deflation is like that car driving backward. And in this case, disinflation is like the car that's driving forward but slowing down, right? So going from 20 miles an hour to 10 miles an hour to 5 miles an hour. It's still going forward. Inflation is still positive, but it's not going as fast. One of the things that's going to be important when we think about inflation and who wants higher inflation and who wants lower inflation is the difference between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. And the real interest rate is what creditors and borrowers should actually be interested in, because it's how much stuff you can pay with that real interest. And it's approximately equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So if the nominal interest rate is 7% and the inflation rate is 3%, then the real interest rate is just 7 minus 3, or 4%. When inflation gets really high, it can be very hurtful to economies. Basically, when we see what we call hyperinflation, economies tend to break down and there's really no more buying or selling in the economy. On the other hand, moderate inflation, 2 to 3 to 4% inflation, can be beneficial, and it can really grease the wheels of the labor market, because sometimes wages actually have to come down, and workers really don't like it when their nominal wage goes down. But if their nominal wage stays the same, but inflation increases so that their real wage now is lower, they don't tend to care as much, and so that can bring us back to full employment a little bit faster. So one thing to keep in mind, as we already discussed a little bit, is that there are winners and losers from when inflation is higher than expected. So if you have a mortgage or a student loan or a car loan with a fixed nominal interest rate, and we end up with higher inflation, then your income is going to tend to go up. So wages tend to increase with inflation, but those nominal debts will stay the same in nominal terms, which means they will shrink in real terms. They become smaller. And so that means it's going to be easier to pay those debts back. On the other hand, people with nominal assets, either those people who have made the loans directly or indirectly, because they have deposits in banks and banks have made the loans, will lose. And so, for instance, the last country that experienced very high hyperinflation was Zimbabwe, although they are in no means unique in terms of that. And nominal assets in that case were, completely wiped out, and the economy really came to a standstill. On the other hand, deflation, when the average price level is actually falling, can also be really bad because consumers will tend not to buy big items today because they figure, well, they'll just be cheaper in 6 months or a year, and they'll sort of put them off, and so that will hurt the economy. And just like higher inflation decreases the size of nominal debts, deflation increases the size of nominal debts, and so mortgage payments, student loan payments, car payments stay the same, but your nominal income shrinks so that your debt payments are taking up a larger piece of your budget and you don't have as much money to spend on other things. So we're going to walk through a few causes of inflation, and basically the idea is that inflation happens because there's some sort of imbalance, either in the product market, so if firms, for instance, can increase prices because of reduced competition, or in the labor market, if the unemployment rate is really low and so workers can demand higher wages, then we can end up with higher inflation. So let's sort of walk through these three possible causes of inflation, and then we'll add one more that's less related to the labor market. So if owners' power rises relative to consumers so that there's less competition, then the profit curve can shift down, meaning their markup can go up. So if, for instance, a firm had a markup of 15% and some of their competitors have gone out of business, now they can have their markup be 25%. That's going to increase the price level. Also, if employees' power rises relative to owners, that will shift the wage curve up, and that will mean that firms have to pay higher wages. They still increase their prices based on how much competition there is in the product market, and so that will increase prices. And finally, during a business cycle, employees will also tend to have more power relative to the business, to their business owners. And so when unemployment is lower, then we'll be on a higher point on the wage curve, and that will mean that we end up with higher inflation. So those are three possible causes related to the profit curve and wage curve that we saw in Chapter 6 and Chapter 9. Another possible cause is this idea of capacity constraints. And so if an economy is capacity constrained, that means that we are producing almost as much as we can, right? And so if the economy is really booming and people want to buy, but firms can't produce more, then they're going to start raising their prices. And if they start raising their prices, that's going to lead to inflation. And we can end up with what we'll call a wage price spiral. And the idea is that wages are one of the main costs of firms. And so when wages go up, in order to keep profits the same, firms increase their prices, and we end up overall with higher inflation.